When Barbara and I first moved into our quiet neighborhood, I thought we were settling into the life we'd always wanted. Our house stood at the end of a tree-lined street, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways and weekend barbecues filled the air with the smell of grilled burgers and laughter. We'd been married for 8 years, long enough for the butterflies to settle into a steady rhythm, but I still believed we had something solid. At first, everything seemed perfect. We spent our weekends gardening or hosting dinner parties. Barbara would laugh as she arranged flowers on the dining table, teasing me about my overcooked steaks. I loved those moments, the easy warmth of her smile, the way she'd lean into my shoulder as we watched the sun set from our porch swing. But somewhere along the way, the warmth began to fade. It started with small things, little shifts in her behavior that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Barbara, who had always been meticulous about our schedules, began missing dinners, claiming late nights at her book club or spontaneous outings with her friends. Her phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, now never seemed to leave her side. When I asked about the change, she brushed it off with a laugh, saying I was imagining things. Then Gregory moved in next door. He arrived on a warm spring afternoon, unloading boxes from a rental truck with the efficiency of someone used to starting over. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy smile that drew people in, Gregory introduced himself with a firm handshake and a promise to keep the noise down. Barbara had been the first to welcome him, carrying over a plate of her homemade brownies before I even had the chance to meet the man. At first, I thought nothing of it. Gregory seemed friendly enough, always quick with a wave when we crossed paths. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice subtle changes in Barbara. Her laughter grew louder, her eyes brighter, especially when Gregory was around. She started spending more time outside, tending to the garden that bordered our properties, her conversations with Gregory stretching longer with each encounter. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, neighbors were supposed to be friendly. But doubt has a way of seeping into the cracks of even the strongest foundations. And late at night, as I lay beside Barbara, listening to the soft hum of her breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through my fingers. The first real sign came on a Friday evening. I arrived home from work earlier than usual, expecting to find Barbara preparing dinner or reading in the living room. Instead, the house was quiet, the faint hum of the television drifting from the den. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors as I called her name. No answer. Moving toward the back of the house, I paused by the kitchen window. Outside, near the fence that separated our yard from Gregory's, I saw them, Barbara laughing as Gregory leaned in close, his hand resting lightly on her arm. The air between them crackled with an energy I couldn't ignore. My pulse quickened as I stepped back from the window, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask. Was I imagining things? Or had I just glimpsed the beginning of something that would tear my world apart? That moment by the window lingered in my mind long after I stepped away. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was harmless, a neighborly conversation, nothing more. But the image of Gregory's hand resting on Barbara's arm, the way she tilted her head back when she laughed, stayed with me like a splinter beneath the skin. That night, I sat across from Barbara at the dinner table, watching her as she sliced into her grilled chicken. She looked radiant, her cheeks flushed, eyes bright with the remnants of laughter that still seemed to linger from her time outside. I tried to shake the nagging feeling, but it clung to me. How's Gregory settling in next door? I asked, keeping my tone light. Barbara glanced up, her smile quick but a little too bright. Oh, he's doing well. Just needed a hand with some gardening tips. I told him he could borrow our hedge clippers. Seems like you two have hit it off. She tilted her head slightly, studying me with an expression that hovered between amusement and something harder to place. Well, it's called being neighborly, Donald. I thought you'd appreciate me helping out. Her words sounded reasonable, but something about her tone made my pulse quicken. I pushed the thought aside and forced a smile. Of course. Just don't let him steal all your gardening secrets. Barbara laughed, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Over the next few days, I couldn't help but notice the small changes in her routine. She spent more time outside, pruning the rose bushes or tending to the vegetable garden that bordered Gregory's yard. Whenever I glanced outside, I'd catch glimpses of them, brief conversations over the fence, Barbara tossing her hair back with a laugh that echoed faintly through the air. I told myself it was nothing. After all, Barbara had always been friendly. But the doubt lingered, a whisper in the back of my mind that grew louder with each passing day. The tipping point came on a Thursday evening. I arrived home late after a meeting at work, the house dark except for the faint glow of the television in the living room. Barbara's car was in the driveway, but she wasn't inside. I checked the kitchen, the den, even the back porch. No sign of her. Frowning, I stepped outside, my footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path that led to the backyard. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses. I paused by the fence, listening. Laughter drifted from Gregory's yard, soft, low, and unmistakably familiar. I stepped closer, heart hammering as I peered through the gaps in the wooden fence. There they were, Barbara and Gregory sitting side by side on his patio, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern above. Gregory leaned in slightly, his fingers brushing against Barbara's as she laughed and pulled her hand away, too slowly. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to step back before they could see me. The blood pounded in my ears as I turned and walked briskly back to the house, each step echoing in my mind like a countdown to something I didn't want to face. Inside, the walls seemed to close in around me as I paced the living room, my thoughts a whirlwind of suspicion and denial. I wanted to believe it was innocent, that I was imagining things. But the image of Barbara's smile, the way her hand lingered just a moment too long against Gregory's, replayed in my mind like a scene I couldn't escape. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The night after I saw Barbara and Gregory on his patio, sleep came in fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smile, soft, radiant, but not for me. By morning, the weight of suspicion clung to my chest like a stone. Barbara moved through the house with her usual grace, her humming drifting softly from the kitchen as she prepared breakfast. I watched her from the doorway, studying the curve of her shoulders, the way her fingers moved deftly as she poured coffee. She looked like the woman I'd married, the woman I thought I knew. But now, every glance, every touch, felt like a question waiting to be answered. "You're quiet this morning," she remarked, setting my coffee cup on the table. "Long night," I replied, my voice carefully neutral. "Work's been hectic lately." She offered a sympathetic smile and leaned down to kiss my cheek. The warmth of her lips lingered against my skin, but it felt different now, like a mask covering something unseen. As she turned away, her phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen before she could reach it. Just a name, Gregory. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression still as she picked up the phone and swiped the notification away. "Everything okay?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Oh, yeah. Just Gregory asking if he can borrow the lawnmower," she replied lightly. Too lightly. I nodded, but the knot in my chest tightened. That evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, I found myself standing near the fence that separated our yard from Gregory's. The faint hum of his lawnmower drifted through the air, accompanied by the rhythmic buzz of cicadas. I hesitated, heart pounding in my chest as I debated whether to step closer. Before I could decide, I heard laughter, Barbara's laughter. It carried through the air, light and unguarded in a way I hadn't heard in months. I moved toward the fence, my breath shallow as I peered through the slats. Barbara stood beside Gregory near his garage, her hand brushing against his arm as she gestured toward the mower. Gregory leaned closer, his smile easy, his gaze fixed on her face. The air between them seemed to hum with an energy I could feel even from a distance. Then, without warning, Gregory reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind Barbara's ear. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her lips parting in a smile that sent a jolt of something sharp and cold through my chest. I stepped back quickly, heart hammering as I retreated into the shadows of our yard. My thoughts spun in frantic circles. Was I imagining things? Reading too much into a moment that might have meant nothing? But deep down, I knew the truth was starting to reveal itself, piece by piece. Inside the house, the air felt stifling as I paced the living room, each step echoing the pulse in my ears. The doubt that had once whispered in the back of my mind now screamed loud enough to drown out everything else that I needed answers, and I needed them soon. The days that followed were a blur of forced smiles and unanswered questions. Every glance between Barbara and Gregory felt like a conversation I couldn't hear, a secret language shared just beyond my reach. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking, that their laughter by the fence, the brush of Gregory's hand against Barbara's, were nothing more than friendly gestures. But the doubt had already taken root, and with each passing day, it grew harder to ignore. Barbara's phone became a constant presence, always within arm's reach. She'd glance at it during dinner, her lips curving into a faint smile before she quickly tucked it away. When I asked who it was, her answers came too easily: Vanessa from work, her sister checking in, the neighborhood group chat. But the flicker of something unspoken lingered in her eyes each time she looked at me. One evening, as Barbara prepared dinner, her phone buzzed against the counter. I glanced at the screen just for a moment, but it was enough. Gregory, same time tomorrow. My breath caught in my throat. Before I could react, Barbara swiped the message away and slipped the phone into her pocket. "Who was that?" I asked, my voice careful but tight. "Vanessa," she replied without missing a beat. "She wants to meet for coffee tomorrow." The lie settled between us like a stone dropped into still water. I forced a smile and nodded, but my mind raced with questions I couldn't ask. That night, sleep evaded me. I lay beside Barbara, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, my thoughts tangled in the web of half-truths and stolen glances. The warmth of her body beside mine felt like a cruel reminder of what I might be losing, piece by piece. The next day, I left work early. I needed to see for myself whether my suspicions were more than just shadows in my mind. I parked down the street from Gregory's house, heart hammering in my chest as I waited. Minutes stretched into an hour, each second tightening the knot in my chest. Then I saw her. Barbara stepped out of the house, her cheeks flushed, her hair slightly tousled as she adjusted her blouse. Gregory stood in the doorway, his gaze following her with an intensity that made my breath catch. She paused, their eyes meeting for a moment too long, before she turned and walked briskly down the driveway. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The truth was no longer a question, it was a fact, undeniable and raw. Barbara drove past without noticing my car, a hollow ache settled deep in my chest. The world outside the windshield seemed distant, muted beneath the weight of what I'd just witnessed. But this wasn't over, not yet. Barbara's car disappeared down the street, but I couldn't bring myself to follow. My hands trembled against the steering wheel as the image of her stepping out of Gregory's house played on a loop in my mind. Her flushed cheeks, the way she smoothed her blouse as if resetting a moment that shouldn't have happened. There was no more room for doubt. I sat in the car for what felt like hours, staring at Gregory's house as questions swirled in my head. How long had this been going on? How had I missed the signs? The weight of betrayal pressed against my chest, each breath shallow and strained. Eventually, I forced myself to drive home. The house felt different when I stepped inside, like a place filled with echoes of laughter that no longer belonged to me. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the spot where Barbara's phone had buzzed the night before. The memory of Gregory's message, "Same time tomorrow," echoed through my mind like a taunt. By the time Barbara returned home that evening, my thoughts had settled into a cold, heavy certainty. She stepped through the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, her movements too deliberate as she set her purse on the counter. "Hey, honey," she said casually. "How was your day?" I studied her, searching for some trace of guilt, some sign that she knew her secret had been exposed. But her smile stayed firmly in place, her eyes meeting mine with practiced ease. "Busy," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. "How was coffee with Vanessa?" Her smile flickered just for a moment, but long enough for me to catch it. "Oh, it was nice. We just caught up on work and life, nothing too exciting." The lie slipped from her lips with such ease that it sent a fresh wave of anger crashing through me. But I swallowed it down, forcing myself to play the part of the unsuspecting husband a little longer. I needed more proof so undeniable that she wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. Over the next few days, I became an observer in my own home. I watched the way Barbara's eyes flicked toward her phone whenever it buzzed, the way she lingered a little too long near the fence when Gregory was outside. Each moment added another crack to the foundation of our marriage, but I forced myself to stay silent. Then, on Friday evening, the opportunity I'd been waiting for arrived. Barbara stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the silver necklace that rested just above the neckline of her dress. She looked stunning, too stunning for a simple night out with friends. "Where are you headed tonight?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Book club," she replied without hesitation. "We're meeting at Sarah's place this time. I shouldn't be too late." I nodded, hiding the way my pulse quickened. "Have fun." She kissed my cheek, her lips warm against my skin, and for a moment, I almost believed the lie. Almost. As soon as she drove away, I grabbed my keys and followed. My heart pounded with each turn of the wheel, my breath shallow as I kept my distance. When she bypassed the road that led to Sarah's house, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. I already knew where she was going, but seeing her car turn onto Gregory Street sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I parked a block away and approached Gregory's house on foot, my footsteps silent against the pavement. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside my chest. Reaching the side of the house, I moved carefully through the shadows until I could see the back patio through the partially open curtains. My breath hitched as I spotted them inside. Barbara standing close to Gregory, her hands resting lightly against his chest as his fingers traced the curve of her waist. Their lips met in a kiss that lingered too long, too intimately. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out every rational thought. I wanted to tear through the door, to demand answers, to shatter the illusion they'd built behind my back. But I forced myself to step back, heart hammering as I took a shaky breath. This wasn't the moment for confrontation, not yet. I needed undeniable proof, because when the time came, I wanted there to be no escape. I stood outside Gregory's house, my breath shallow as I stared through the curtain's narrow gap. The sight of Barbara in his arms burned itself into my mind, the way her fingers curled against his chest, the tilt of her head as their lips met in a kiss that lingered too long for anything innocent. Every muscle in my body tensed, but I forced myself to stay still. This wasn't the moment for confrontation. Not yet. Stepping back from the window, I clenched my fists to steady my shaking hands. The air felt heavier, thick with the weight of what I'd just witnessed. I wanted to storm inside, to demand answers, but anger would only lead to half-truths and excuses. I needed undeniable proof, evidence that would tear through any lie Barbara might try to spin. Turning on my heel, I moved quickly back to my car. The night air pressed against my skin, cool and sharp as I slipped into the driver's seat. My pulse pounded in my ears as I sat motionless for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as the image of Barbara and Gregory replayed in my mind. By the time I returned home, the house felt colder, emptier. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the framed photos on the wall, images of vacations, anniversaries, moments that now felt like distant echoes of a life that had slipped through my fingers. Hours passed in heavy silence. Midnight came and went, but I couldn't sleep. I paced the living room, each step echoing against the hardwood floor as I rehearsed the confrontation that would inevitably come. My thoughts raced with questions I couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? How had I missed the signs? And most of all, why? The faint hum of a car engine broke the silence, pulling me from my thoughts. I stepped to the window just as Barbara's headlights swept across the driveway. My breath hitched as I watched her step from the car, her movement slow, almost cautious. She paused at the front door, adjusting her blouse as if smoothing away the evidence of what had just happened. The door creaked softly as she stepped inside, her heels clicking against the tile floor. She paused when she saw me standing in the doorway, her smile quick and carefully composed. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice light but slightly strained. "Yeah," I replied, my voice even despite the storm churning beneath my skin. Couldn't sleep. She set her purse on the counter, her fingers lingering against the leather strap for a moment too long. Book club ran late. Sarah made this new sangria recipe, and we all lost track of time. Another lie. I studied her face, searching for some trace of guilt, but her smile stayed firmly in place. How easily she lied, how effortlessly the words slipped from her lips as if they carried no weight at all. I forced a smile. Sounds fun. Her gaze lingered on mine as if searching for something beneath my calm exterior, but I gave her nothing. After a moment, she turned and disappeared down the hallway, her footsteps fading into the bedroom. I exhaled slowly, my hands trembling at my sides. The moment of confrontation was approaching. I could feel it like a storm gathering on the horizon. But not yet, not until I had the proof that would leave her with no escape. Barbara's footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving me alone in the silence of the darkened house. Her lies still echoed in my mind, smooth, effortless, as if the truth had never even crossed her lips. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the faint glow of her phone where it rested on the counter. My pulse quickened as I debated whether to reach for it, but the risk of getting caught held me back. Not yet. Upstairs, I heard the faint creak of the bedroom door closing. My breath slowed as I steadied my thoughts. The confrontation was coming. I could feel it like thunder in the distance. But when it happened, I needed more than suspicion. I needed the truth, laid bare, with no room for denial. For now, I would wait, but not for long. The next morning arrived with a strange sense of calm, as if the storm brewing beneath the surface had momentarily stilled. Barbara moved through the kitchen with her usual grace, humming softly as she poured coffee and buttered toast. To anyone watching, we might have seemed like the perfect couple, comfortable, familiar, untouched by suspicion. But beneath my steady gaze, the cracks in our marriage widened with every lie she told. I might be home late tonight, she said casually, stirring cream into her coffee. Vanessa wants to try that new wine bar downtown. My chest tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. Sounds nice. What time do you think you'll be back? Not too late, she replied, her smile quick and rehearsed. Don't wait up. I nodded and sipped my coffee, already formulating my next move. This time, I wouldn't just follow her, I'd gather the proof that would leave no room for denial. That evening, I parked a block away from Gregory's house, heart hammering in my chest as I waited. The minutes crawled by until Barbara's car appeared at the end of the street. I watched as she parked in Gregory's driveway, stepping out with the ease of someone who belonged there. Gregory met her at the door, his smile quick and familiar as he pulled her inside. My breath hitched, but I forced myself to stay calm. Moving quickly and quietly, I approached the side of the house, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. The faint murmur of voices drifted from inside, followed by soft laughter that sent a chill down my spine. Stepping closer to the window, I raised my phone and pressed record. My pulse pounded in my ears as I captured the scene through the narrow gap in the curtains, Barbara's hands trailing down Gregory's chest, their lips meeting in a kiss that deepened with unmistakable intent. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep filming even as my chest ached with the weight of what I was witnessing. Their movements became more heated, clothes slipping from shoulders, hands exploring with a hunger that left no doubt as to what was about to happen. I pulled back before I could see more, my breath ragged as I steadied myself against the side of the house. My hands trembled as I stopped the recording, the proof I needed now saved within the phone's memory. This was it, the moment that would change everything. Now, all that remained was the confrontation, and this time, there would be no escape. I drove home in silence, the proof of Barbara's betrayal heavy in my pocket. The faint hum of the engine seemed distant, drowned out by the pounding of my pulse in my ears. Every breath felt shallow, my chest tight with the weight of what I had just witnessed. I'd known deep down, but seeing it with my own eyes had stripped away any lingering doubt. The house felt colder than ever as I stepped inside, the familiar walls now holding the echoes of a life that had unraveled beyond repair. I sat at the kitchen table, phone clutched tightly in my hand, staring at the screen as if the images might somehow change. But they didn't. Barbara's smile, the heat in her gaze as she touched Gregory. Those moments were now etched into my mind with a clarity that burned. Hours passed in heavy silence. The clock ticked past midnight, then 1, but still, I waited. Each second stretched longer than the last, the anticipation tightening my chest like a vice. Finally, the faint hum of a car engine broke the stillness outside. Headlights swept across the window as Barbara's car pulled into the driveway. My breath hitched as I stood, heart hammering as her footsteps approached the front door. The lock clicked, and she stepped inside, pausing when she saw me standing in the doorway. Her smile faltered for a moment before she quickly recovered, slipping off her heels with practiced ease. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice light but cautious. That I held her gaze, my pulse steady despite the fire burning beneath my skin. "Yeah. Couldn't sleep." She set her purse down and crossed the room, her smile carefully composed. "You should have gone to bed. I told you I might be late." Vanessa wouldn't stop ordering drinks. Another lie. So smooth, so effortless that my fingers tightened around the phone in my hand as I took a slow step forward. "Vanessa, huh?" Barbara's smile faltered slightly, her eyes flicking to mine with a flicker of something caution, maybe even fear. "Yeah," she said, her voice quick, too quick. "Why?" I didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, I stepped past her, heart pounding in my chest as I moved toward the living room. The moment was approaching, the confrontation that would tear through the carefully woven lies she'd built, but not yet, not until she had no way out. Barbara stood frozen in the doorway, her smile wavering as I stepped past her into the living room. My pulse pounded with a steady, deliberate rhythm as I turned to face her. The phone in my pocket felt heavier than ever, the proof of her betrayal waiting to shatter the silence that hung between us. She closed the door softly behind her, setting her heels aside with practiced care. "Donald, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice light but laced with an undercurrent of tension. That I met her gaze, studying the faint flush on her cheeks, the way her fingers toyed with the edge of her blouse as if smoothing away invisible creases. My breath came slow and steady as I stepped closer. "You tell me," I replied, my voice calm despite the fire smoldering beneath the surface. Her smile flickered, her eyes searching mine as if gauging how much I knew. "I don't know what you mean," she said with a soft laugh. "Vanessa and I don't," I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to slice through her words. Her breath hitched, and I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes before she masked it with a carefully composed expression. "What's going on, Donald?" she asked, her tone shifting to something softer, almost concerned. That I pulled the phone from my pocket, my pulse hammering in my ears as I unlocked the screen. For a moment, I stared at the image frozen on the display, Barbara's hands on Gregory's chest, their lips locked in a kiss that left no room for doubt. Then, without a word, I held it up for her to see. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face as she took an involuntary step back. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The air between us crackled with the weight of everything unspoken. "Donald. I can explain," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Explain?" My voice hardened as I stepped forward, holding her gaze with an intensity that pinned her in place. "Explain how you've been sneaking around with our neighbor. How you've lied to my face, night after night, while you—" I cut myself off, the words catching in my throat before I could finish. Tears pooled in her eyes as she shook her head, hands trembling at her sides. "It's not what you think. Gregory and I don't lie to me," I snapped, my voice sharp with the force of everything I'd held back. "I saw you, Barbara. I saw you with him. And I have the proof." Her breath hitched as she took another step back, her gaze flicking toward the hallway as if searching for an escape. "But there was none." "Please, Donald, it wasn't supposed to happen this way," she whispered, her voice breaking, but it did. My chest ached with the weight of the truth, but I forced myself to stand firm. "You made a choice, Barbara. Every time you left this house, every time you touched him, you chose this." Silence stretched between us, heavy with the finality of what couldn't be undone, and this time, there was no going back. Barbara's breath hitched as she took another step back, her eyes wide with fear and something else, guilt. Her hands clutched the edge of her blouse as if she could shield herself from the truth laid bare between us. My pulse pounded in my ears as I held up the phone again, the damning image still glowing on the screen. "You lied to me," I said, my voice low and steady despite the fire burning in my chest. "Over and over again. Every night you said you were with Vanessa, every time you smiled and kissed me goodbye you were going to him." Tears welled in her eyes, but I saw the flicker of something else beneath the surface, defiance, perhaps, or the desperate urge to twist the truth into something she could control. "Donald, please. It wasn't supposed to happen." "Gregory and you keep saying that," I interrupted sharply, my voice cutting through hers like a blade. "What wasn't supposed to happen, Barbara? The first kiss? The first time you slept with him? Or the fact that I found out?" Her lips trembled as she took a shaky breath, but she didn't answer. "Tell me the truth," I demanded, stepping forward until only a few feet separated us. "How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, her gaze darting toward the floor before meeting mine again. "A few months," she whispered. "A few months?" The words tasted bitter in my mouth. "And every single time, you looked me in the eye and lied." "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice cracking. "I never wanted this to happen, but what, Barbara?" My hands clenched at my sides as I fought to keep my voice steady. "You wanted something I couldn't give you? You thought sneaking around with the neighbor was the answer?" "It wasn't like that," she protested, her voice rising as if she could still control the narrative. "It just happened. I didn't plan it, Donald. Gregory and don't say his name." My voice dropped to a growl, and she fell silent. The air between us felt suffocating, heavy with all the words we could never take back. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock were the only sounds that filled the space between us. Finally, I stepped back, the phone falling to my side as I exhaled slowly. "I loved you, Barbara," I said quietly. "I trusted you with everything. But now, I can't even look at you without seeing him." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but I forced myself to turn away before her sorrow could soften the edges of my resolve. "This marriage is over," I said, my voice firm despite the ache in my chest. "There's nothing left to save." I moved toward the hallway without looking back, the weight of finality settling over me with every step. Behind me, Barbara's muffled sobs echoed through the silence, but I didn't stop, because this time, there was no turning back. Barbara's sobs echoed through the silence, but I kept walking. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything but the weight of her betrayal. "Donald, please," her voice cracked, but I didn't turn around. "There's nothing left to say," I replied, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "You made your choice. Now, I'm making mine." Her footsteps faltered as I reached the bedroom. I paused at the doorway, gripping the frame as if it could steady the storm inside me. "This marriage is over, Barbara," I said without looking back. "You and Gregory can have each other." Her sobs grew louder as I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. This time, there was no going back. Morning light crept through the window as I stood silently, staring at Gregory's house. "Donald, please, can we talk?" Barbara's voice trembled behind me. I didn't turn. "Talk? About how you chose him over me? How you lied every night? I never stopped loving you," she whispered. I faced her, my voice calm. "Love doesn't lie, Barbara. What we had is gone." Without another word, I stepped past her, opened the front door, and let the cool air hit my face. "Goodbye, Barbara." I walked outside without looking back. The air outside felt sharper as I stepped onto the porch, each breath cutting through the heaviness clinging to my chest. Behind me, I heard Barbara's faint footsteps stop just inside the doorway. "Donald," her voice wavered, but I didn't turn. I paused at the bottom of the steps, gripping the railing as the weight of everything we'd built pressed against my shoulders. But the image of her with Gregory, the stolen glances, the late-night lies burned too vividly in my mind. Without looking back, I spoke. "We can't come back from this. You know that." Silence stretched between us, broken only by the faint hum of morning traffic in the distance. I waited, half expecting her to say something, to reach out one last time. But no words came. Stepping off the porch, I walked to my car, each step lighter than the last. As I opened the door, I glanced toward Gregory's house, silent, still, and yet the reason everything had fallen apart that I got in and started the engine. The low rumble echoed through the quiet street as I pulled away without hesitation. This time, I didn't look back, because there was nothing left to see. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet as I drove away from the house that had once been my home. Each mile put more distance between me and the life I'd left behind, a life built on trust that had crumbled beneath the weight of betrayal. Barbara's face lingered in my mind, the tears in her eyes, the trembling in her voice. But I pushed the memory aside. Love couldn't survive where lies had taken root. What we had was gone, and no amount of apologies could bring it back. By the time I reached the edge of town, my breath felt easier, the tightness in my chest beginning to loosen. I pulled over at a small park, stepping out to let the crisp air clear my thoughts. Birds called softly from the trees, their songs a reminder that the world moved on, even after heartbreak. I sat on a bench, staring out at the horizon as the first light of morning painted the sky in soft golds and blues. The ache in my heart hadn't disappeared, but beneath it, something new had begun to stir. Hope. For the first time in months, the weight of suspicion and lies no longer pressed against my chest. The truth, as painful as it had been, had set me free. I stood, inhaling deeply as I let the past fall away. My future was mine to rebuild brick by brick, day by day. Without looking back, I returned to my car and drove forward, because this wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new one.